Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Welcome everyone to this pension committee meeting on the 12th of December 2024. We'll go straight into it. We've got quite a lot on the agenda. Okay, so I would ask the people to be quite clear with questions and comments. Keep it succinct and quite short because we want to be able to pick on. And just try and cast your voice a little bit louder than normal. You've got a little bit of noise out here. Okay, we'll move on to apologies.
Then we have apology from Councillor Allen, Councillor Bunny, and Joe Bowles.
Thank you. On to item 2, which is declarations of members' interest. We all know where we are there. If we want to declare it now, can do, or if an item comes up. Please. All.
Yeah, that's not really.
Anyone else? Perhaps not here. But thank you very much for that. The minutes of the previous meeting on the 17th of October. I'll take 5 to 10. Hope you've all read them. I think that's a fair reflection of what went on at that meeting. If there's any matters that anybody wants to bring through now, I would welcome that. Otherwise, if we can agree, please, to accept those lists. Vote by Tom. Biden, could have a quick vote on that, please. Thank you. Thank you. And we'll go straight into the piece of the agenda, which is the agenda item 4, independent advisors report. Well, Paul, as you know, was appointed not too long ago, and unfortunately can't be here today because he's got a previous engagement on this date. So, Joe is taking that.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. So this is the first paper that he's sent on to us. I don't plan on going through it. It's his opinions. But what I'm happy to do is take any questions back to Paul, or if it's something more general that you have as a question, it might be something that Ian will be able to answer. He has managed to rearrange his diaries for next year, so we'll be able to attend all our meetings going forwards. So I'll open it up to have any questions or comments. It'd be interesting just to hear if you're happy with how he's presented the report, if there's anything different that you would prefer to see, and I can feed that back.
Any comments? I think it was quite clear. I always felt Paul knows his stuff about pensions, particularly along. He's been in it many, many years. So I think any points he does make, we need to listen and be clear to him. Okay, so if we can agree those, please.
Other than what you said, Chairman, I think it's very helpful and certainly welcome to have that back on the agenda. I find it very useful, very informative myself. As you say, he knows his stuff, so we need to be ears open and listening to what he has to say. No, very, very good and very useful.
Thank you. Are you happy with that? Okay, we'll move on to item 5, which is a responsible investment updated report. Actually, Claire's doing that for us.
The report brings to committee details of the fund's responsible investment activities during the second quarter of 24-25. The report was a recommendation that the committee consider the report and discuss the responsible investment activity undertaken during the quarter. Information on engagement and voting activity from that, Auditor Co, Robeco, Legal and General and Morgan Stanley are included within the report and supported by a number of appendices and links throughout the report to further information for committee members' information. Sections 2 to 6 of the report set out the engagement activity for the quarter, and just to highlight, during the quarter, LAP have continued dialogue with companies including BP, Shell, and sectors such as aviation, steel and cement to promote sustainable practices. From an environmental perspective, they have engaged with tobacco companies focusing on reducing single-use plastics and managing water-related risks. And in the governance space, engagements have included zero-hour contracts and remuneration practices. Border to Coast have published a report examining the academic evidence for both divestment and engagement in the context of climate change. And there's a link in the report in the committee paper, which will take you to that report. Section 7 covers voting, and the report details voting activities across the various Border to Coast equity funds, highlighting instances where votes were cast against management recommendations. Section 8 sets out the ESG and carbon reporting for the Border to Coast equity sub-funds that we're invested in, as well as for investment grade credit. Section 9 covers the Stewardship Code. The fund submitted its Stewardship Code report to the Financial Reporting Council for 23-24, and a copy of the document is attached to the report at Appendix H. Results are expected in the spring, and we will share those with the committee once received. And just a reminder for the committee that we've been a signatory to the new code from its introduction in 2020. The report in this section also provides details of the review of the current stewardship codes, and we will be feeding into that consultation process in the new year. And I'm very happy to take any questions on the report from the committee.
Any comments or questions?
Yes, I've got my hand up. Sir.
Crack on.
Thank you, Chairman. Had an email from Mr. Greg, who's sitting right behind me here. I'd just like to ask a question there. Thank you for your report. I won't read out the whole of the email, but there's just one particular part of it. And he states that Climate Action 100 states that neither Shell or BP have short or medium greenhouse gas emission targets that are aligned with the Paris Agreement, should limit global temperature increase to 1.5 degrees, which we know is. So I'd argue that this is hardly an example of good value. This is Mr. Griggs' words, not mine. That this is hardly an example of good value, and in fact illustrates the failure of engagement and the effect in mitigating climate change with these companies. Before you answer, Claire, I know I went to the Joint Committee just a few weeks ago, and we had a very good run through. And I asked the question about RI. They give a very detailed report back, which I forwarded to Mr. Griggs, so he knows what's in there. But if you just answer the question about Shell and BP as to whether they're actually meeting any targets, if they have any targets, that's my question.
Thank you for that, and thank you for attending today. I wonder actually maybe if I can pass over to Border to Coast as our major equity investor and an organisation who is engaging with companies on our behalf and have been engaging with BP and Shell. Could you take that, Dave?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So the view from Border to Coast is obviously it's disappointing that these companies have rode back on communicated commitments. I guess where that leaves us now is considering what other options are available to us. We'll obviously consider engagement. That's always been our philosophy over divesting. The rationale being that you have to be an investor of a company in order to drive change. If you're not an investor, then someone else will pick up that ownership and may not wish to seek that engagement and I guess have an impact, try to drive an impact. But where do we go when engagement doesn't work? Well, we have an escalation strategy, which would be the next port of call. And I suppose the different options that might be considered there will be conducting collaborative engagement with other institutional investors. So really boosting the voice of how we feel about these matters. We can register a concern on a voting related matter at the shareholder meeting. We can publicly pre-declare how we will vote for these companies. and we can look to either file or co-file a resolution. There are a number of strategies that we're able to go to next.
If I might just add to that, please. Obviously, and this was also discussed at the joint committee about where the ESG team, responsible investment team within Border to Coast, they make their recommendations to the investment team on the outcome of any ESG concerns across the whole remit of the EDS and the G. But just to remind the committee, this is one of the many considerations that the investments team then take into account. The RI does not drive the investment decisions. It's the fiduciary objective duty of the committee and therefore the investors managing our money to ensure that we make that required return, but in a responsible way. So this was a question that did come up in JC about if the RI team were to suggest that the investment team should disinvest, would that automatically happen? The answer would be no. The investment team would look at the risks around that company that have been raised in that report, along with all the other investment risks and opportunities. So just to remind the committee of how that process actually works.
To come back, Chairman.
Yes.
Okay. Obviously, sure, everyone in the room knows that there are 11 chairs or representatives of the funds within Border to Coast. We're not the only one to raise things about RI investment and to make sure that things are working. But generally speaking, the consensus is that Border to Coast are doing the right thing. And Dave rightly mentions this investment is not necessarily the answer. If you're not in the tent, you can't do anything about it, basically. So it's important that, having said that, we still have to take responsible investment very seriously. I agree with you, Joe. It shouldn't drive the actual performance factor, but it's something that has to be added on to it. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. How do we think the changes in the administration may have going to impact on this whole climate issues? Because there's going to be probably a different emphasis to what there's been in the past.
I'll put a bit and then Dave might want to add something else on. I mean, there have been some changes already that we've seen with some of the managers that have a large market in the US stepping back. Bailey Gifford is one that's recently taken its name off, supporting Climate Action 100, I think, and another. Yeah. We don't have Bailey Gifford as one of our managers. That's in the UK Alpha Fund. But other managers are stepping back. Some of it, however, is that they're not actually stepping back from doing, they're stepping back from how they're wording things, how they're actually advertising themselves so that they don't fall foul of any of the US regulations that are coming in various states. So it is an issue. It's an issue that we're very aware of, something Border to Coast are very aware of. But hopefully the issue we've always said at Lincolnshire Pension Fund is we want to be long-term sustainable investors, however that sustainability fits in. So I'll let Dave add anything else that he might wish to.
Yeah, I completely agree with what Joe's saying there. I guess as a sort of overview of what we're seeing in the States is that these investment managers are continuing to do and act in the right way. But what they're finding is they're spending a lot of time and resource having to fend off legal challenge from senators and states with their association as part of these groups. That is just not worthwhile for that effort for the underlying customer. And so their preferred route is to continue doing what they're doing by working best practice and focusing on that and investing rather than having spent all their time in and out of the courts.
Anyone else speaking on that, this agenda item? Right, thank you. We'll move on to agenda item 6, which is the annual policy review, Border to Coast responsible investment policy, corporate governance, voting guidelines and climate change. On that, Claire?
Yep. So the paper brings to committee the Border to Coast responsible investment policies and highlights changes to the current versions. It is a recommendation that the committee consider the proposed Border to Coast responsible investment policy, corporate governance and voting guidelines and climate change policy, and agree to align the Lincolnshire RI policy and voting guidelines to those of Border to Coast. As the committee are aware, there is an annual review process of these policies, and details of that are set out in section 2 of the report on page 116. Sections 3 to 5 take each policy in turn and detail the changes which have been made from last year. The review of the policies this year has only resulted in a small number of changes, and this largely focuses on clarifying the existing actions which are being taken through these policies. The main update relates to deforestation risk, and the policies have been updated to explicitly detail the issue of nature and biodiversity and reflect the activity which Border to Coast is largely already undertaking. Paragraphs 4.3 to 4.5 provide further information on the context for this clarification to the policies. If the committee are content with the changes to the Border to Coast RI and voting policies and approve the realignment of these documents, then we will make necessary amendments and these will be published in the new year. And I'm very happy to take any questions on the report.
Any comments? I believe there's a little change from last year, isn't it, in that policy document which we approved last year. Pretty similar lines. Move forward with that then. So we've got a recommendation there that consider the report which we've done and agree to align the Lincolnshire RI policy and voting guidelines to Border to Coast. We're happy with that. A little vote on that, please. You go to that. Lovely, thank you. We move on to item 7, which is the task force on climate related financial disclosure progress. The next step, I think that's Joe.
That is, thank you, Chairman. So this report provides a recap of the training and the work undertaken by the committee so far with respect to the expected task force on climate related financial disclosures, TCFD requirements, and any other climate related issues, as well as decisions that have been made and the next steps for the fund. It does have a recommendation that the committee consider and discuss the report, agree that officers continue working with the investment consultant and climate specialists from Hymans Robertson to meet the timetable for TCFD disclosure reporting and update the committee on progress. Ian Campbell will update the committee on what has happened to date and what's required to do ahead of producing a compliant report by the expected deadline of Q4 2025. I think the feeling from the last training in September was actually this is a very complex area. The key decisions have been made, and actually it might be better for officers to work separately with the investment consultant and the climate reporting specialist to bring this together to update the committee on progress and bring that draft to a future committee meeting. So that's the recommendation. But I'll hand over to Ian now just to recap on what has been done so far.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. So just a quick reminder, TCFD, it's a framework to help and encourage companies and investors to consider, measure, manage, report financial risks and opportunities that come from climate change. That's what we've been talking about over this year. It's a requirement for private sector pension schemes to want to take this in the UK. It's very much expected to become a requirement for the LGPS. It keeps getting delayed, but it is coming. So we decided, let's get on with this. Let's not wait for regulations. So we've been through a number of training sessions this year on this topic. There's a lot of different areas to it. We've covered areas like strategy, investment strategy considerations, time horizons, risk management, how we find opportunities, and also scenario analysis as well. So the paper in the pack on page 129 just covers a summary of what we've covered, what's been agreed, to then give us an agreed basis for officers and advisors to take this work away and come back with a final report for you in future. To cover what we've discussed in the last section, we talked a lot about timeframes. It's a requirement of the TCFD framework to set a definition of what we mean by short, medium and long term. So short term was agreed to be 4 years to coincide with typical council election cycle. Medium term was 10 years, and then long term was 25 years, which handily ties into a net zero date of 2050. On metrics, it's expected, as has happened in the private sector pension schemes, that specific metrics you have to measure will be mandated. So whilst we don't have that information, we're able to base that on what's currently provided for private sector schemes. One expectation they'll be similar for the LGPS, but will remain flexible based on whatever actually is considered, and then we can set short-term targets around these metrics as well. We'll also work on the basis of a net zero target date 2050. This ties into borders to coasts, so that makes perfect sense given they're managing all the assets, but also the vast majority of the LGPS. No one's gone later than that. There's a few who've gone earlier, but that makes most sense to us and also ties in with the government aims. So the next steps will be for the officers and advisors to keep working away on this. We can undertake measurement of the fund's current position with what's called a carbon footprint. We can look into targets for how we'd reduce those metrics based off of that initial carbon footprint, engage with managers like Borders to Coast for how they are considering these issues, potentially what improvements can be made. We'll also need to undertake climate scenario analysis to look at potential impact on the fund of different levels of severity of climate change, likely in tandem with your actuarial valuation next year. And then we will come back with this initial report for you next year. That's all I'd say on that.
And if I can just add something, obviously we'll be working closely with Borders to Coast, who will be our main equity manager, and consultation going ahead and changes going ahead will be our only manager across the whole of our funds. It makes no sense for us to be going in a different direction. So the 2050 is aligned, and what's going to be done to enable us to meet that will be work, as I say, we will work very closely with Borders to Coast and the other partner funds to ensure that the vehicles we're offered enable us to do that.
Thank you, Joe. Any comments or questions on that? No, well, it is work in progress, as we say, but we've got a recommendation here that we consider and discuss the report, which we've done, to agree that officers continue working with investment consultant and climate specialists from Harland Robertson to meet timetable for task force on climate related financial disclosures, reporting and update the committee on progress. Those in the second one. Any or we can all raise our hands if you agree and engage. Thank you. Agenda item 8, the LGPS fit for future consultation. Joe?
Yes, thank you. So this is something that's been taking up an awful lot of my time recently. It does have a recommendation that the committee consider and discuss the proposals within the consultation LGPS fit for the future, and officers will use those comments, take them back and formulate a response to the consultation's questions. So the committee will have seen the note that we shared in the weekly email of the 18th of November, that the Chancellor of the Exchequer launched 2 consultations following her Mansion House speech. And that followed the work that had been done on the pensions investment review. An interim report for that review was also published at the same time. The objective for the LGPS that she set out was to overhaul the way the LGPS invests to deliver large pools of professionally managed capital in line with international best practice, while embedding investment in local communities as a priority, placing the scheme on a stronger, more sustainable footing in the interests of members, employers and local taxpayers. I'm not going to discuss the DC consultation because that doesn't impact us at all. So this is solely concentrating on the LGPS consultation.
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, Joe, we obviously discussed that at the last joint committee as well. The interesting thing is that they've counted out that there won't be one pool throughout the whole country, so that's good news. Question is, assuming transition of funds from the 11 funds transition to make the 50 billion, would that mean that we don't have to perhaps take in another fund or indeed another pool to join us? Of course, I know that all 11 funds have to agree to that anyway. It's not a majority decision. It has to be all 11. But then there's the talk with the new pensions minister that they're looking to move to 100 billion. And within wildest dreams, I don't think the 11 funds are going to hit 100 billion in the near term anyway. So can you just elaborate a little bit on that, please?
Yeah, and we'll cover some of those bits, but
Okay,
just
sorry.
given time, and I know that you do have to leave, unfortunately.
So
I'll respond to that bit now, and then I may repeat myself slightly. But I think Border to Coast is pretty much at the 50 billion. That's not going to be an issue for us at all. The desire of government is that 8 pools is probably too many, so that there should be some consolidation. Some of that may happen quite naturally. The requirements within the regulations set out very clearly that all pools must be FCA regulated and approved by the FCA. Now, that is not the case for a number of the pools at the moment. For example, Access, for example, Northern, for example, Wales. Brunel is partially regulated. So these pools will have to do something different. And there are discussions going on, given the short time frame, which I'll cover. Are they able to get the FCA regulations? Will they be able to meet all the requirements, such as in capabilities to internal management, etc., that are set out within the proposals? Can they do that by March 26? Or can they put forward a plan to assure government that they can do that? Is probably the better point. So I think we could sit there and be quite comfortable and say we don't need to look at this. However, if you recall from the 2030 plan, it was already that what should we have in place should another fund want to come into Border to Coast. Obviously, Border to Coast is held in very high regard across the LGPS, not just with LGPS practitioners, but also across the fund management industry. So there may well be funds that approach us and say, we know our pool is looking to do X, Y, Z. However, actually, we like what Border to Coast do. Can we come and join you? So there is a plan in place that senior officers have been involved in agreeing. I think it's in the final stages of finishing that. So should anyone be approached, or should another pool approach us and say, can we combine? There will be a very clear process that will be followed to do all the due diligence behind that. Does it make sense? What we don't want to do is dilute all the benefits that we've got within Border to Coast already of working as a really coherent partnership. So too many members in there. London CIV has issues because they've got 32 funds in there, all with very different opinions. We don't want to be in that position of herding cats. So anyone that comes in will be subject to 100% shareholder approval. But there are a number of processes in place, different groups involved, all the stakeholders, before it would get to that yes/no position, to make sure that it would be in the best interests of Border to Coast. So I think, as I say, I'll go into a bit more detail about the consultation, but I think the one thing we can say is the consultation didn't go as far as we were concerned it might. We thought there might be mandation to merge pools. We thought there might be mandation to merge funds. None of that is there. It's very much, this is how we want it to be. Go ahead and do it. Now, that's not saying that if we don't do what they want, there might not be something else come out in the future if we've not done as ours. But I think hopefully I can reassure the committee that we're not just going to open our arms as Border to Coast to anyone that wants to come in. They will have to fit the very strong ethos that we have, the culture that is within Border to Coast and the 11 partner funds, before they've got to jump through a lot of hurdles it's not the correct term, jump over a lot of hurdles probably rather than through, before they'd be able to come and sit at the table with us.
Chairman, if I can just come back briefly, sorry, I have to leave. I've got to chair the Joint Leaders Committee at time to. So I'll ask one last question. Is there a danger? I just want to know this before I go. You may cover it later on anyway. Is there a danger that LGPS funds could be raided to make sure that it meets government requirements?
What, sorry? Rated.
Raided.
I think the way they're going to ensure that the funds are meeting the government's requirements is what they're looking to bring in is the biennial governance review. So I do think that may become consolidation through the back door. So if you're not meeting those requirements, then government have had this stick since the 2016 regulations came in, and they have yet to use it. I think what we're seeing now is a much firmer, you will do this without mandating. So I think particularly some of the very small funds where they don't have the resources in place to, managing the LGPS is an incredibly complex thing. There's a lot of stuff to look at. It's not just the investments, the admin, the governance, all these other things. So where perhaps there are some of the smaller London boroughs that might have one person whose role is managing the fund plus looking after the council's insurance, their audit and everything else, that's probably not going to meet the requirements on the biennial governance review. So it might be that if a fund is not doing that, they may have to put an improvement plan in place. If it doesn't meet it, they will be strongly advised, is probably how it will be, that they should find another fund to work with and perhaps merge.
Thank you, Chair. Less than a million miles off here. This is paper, I think. It's the bit about. It seems to me that the government are wanting to take powers off committee members and go towards professional. So got you wrong. You mentioned it at the start of the paper. Professional teams to go ahead and do this. And that's the first part of it. So without needs to take there. And the second part of it is obviously the new government and whatever. But I always thought that the core, the core thing about this is looking after the 6.7 million workers' money, not taking it into wild stock markets and then maybe not put it very well, but into sort of like corporate bodies and whatnot, and to me they're actually risking these people's money. Now I'm maybe a million miles off, but maybe could you answer that, please?
Yes, I think in terms of taking away the powers of the Pensions Committee, actually what the consultation is doing is actually just reinforcing what was in the 2016 regulations, in that the asset allocation sits firmly with the Pensions Committee, the strategy, the setting the objectives, the investment beliefs, that still sits and will sit with the committee. What's happening is the implementation of that. And this is what they tried in the 16, but as I say, they left it quite woolly. So some funds used it to maintain as much control as they could and didn't kind of play the game to pass assets across. The implementation of that strategy generally accounts for only about 20% of the performance. When you look at setting investment strategy and the outcomes, about 80% of the outcome is based on the strategy you set. So are you in equities? Are you in bonds? Are you in property, for example? That is where 80% of the return comes from. That decision making can still sit with Lincolnshire Pension Fund for what we do for our £3.5 billion. When we say we want equities, what will then happen is Board to Coast. I'll come on to something on there in a minute with whatever advisors are there. Well, Board to Coast will say, okay, we've looked at your investment strategy, we've looked at the objectives that you've set. From our vehicles, how can we implement that to give you the return that you've asked for within those risk parameters that you're content with? So those key areas are not moving from the committee. The selection of the underlying managers moved back in 2016. That will not come back. And so there's no change there. This is just firming up those regulations because a number of funds haven't followed them. So the Border to Coast funds generally have done what we were asked. We've set the strategy, we've handed it over. We now hold Border to Coast to account for that performance. We're accountable for the strategy, they're accountable for the performance of that implementation. So hopefully that reassures you that there's no change in power. All the other really important things that we have to do as a committee are still there in overseeing the administration, making sure our members are being paid when they should be paid. That is more critical, in my opinion, than the investments, which kind of follows on to the increased risk. I don't believe the strategy that we have, the risk has increased at all. Border to Coast are not making those decisions on the risk. That is set within the overall strategic asset allocation of the committee, looking at what risk we're willing to take to get what return. So that is set by the committee. There is never any, say never, under the current system, there is not a risk to scheme members getting their pensions because they are guaranteed in inverted commas by government. So even if we underperform in a year, it's not like in the private sector in the defined contribution scheme. If we underperform in a year by 40%, markets crash, our scheme members will still get the benefits that they're entitled to. That will not change. That will not change under pooling. This is just how the investments are managed. The biggest risk is actually to the employers, because if we're not having if Border to Coast and the underlying managers are not doing a good job, if markets are crashing, it may be out of their hands, but if we're not getting the return that's required as set out within our valuation, then the employer's contribution rates increase. So it's not the scheme members where there's no risk that lies with our scheme members. We look after the LGPS's 6.7 million members there. That's fine, that's guaranteed. The risk is to the employers. If we don't do what we're doing well, over a long term, we've got to get that phrase in there, over the long term, it will impact our employers' contribution rates. So that's where the risk sits. So that be that the council, be that our small schedule bodies, our academies. So that's why we need to ensure that we maintain the correct level of knowledge and oversight of what Border to Coast are doing in implementing our strategy. So, excuse me. So hopefully that gives you some comfort that one, we're not losing power because that went in 2016. That decision to appoint and sack managers, that's long gone, and that there is no risk to our scheme members. And what we have to do as a committee is ensure that we can understand how the investments are being implemented. We can set the right strategic asset allocation with the appropriate advice, and that we're holding those managers to account.
Yeah.
Just one. Yeah, we're saying maybe taking over council hours job, but a bit to do with glue. It gets to me when you say that, all these guaranteed and it's under it. If all this billions and billions goes into the stock markets and the stock markets crash or whatever reason, or whatever goes on, we're living in a world at the minute where there's a lot of uncertainty, at least like that. But so just taking on what's happened since the government come in, they were saying there was a 22 billion black hole, we didn't know that, and all this, that, and the other. How can you be certain that their pensions can be guaranteed if there's a crash or something was wrong because there's a war or something like that? I don't know.
So, I mean, I've been in the pensions team since 1999, and we've had markets fly and we've had markets fall 20-40% throughout that time. That's the natural volatility you get in stock markets.
I've seen the 2008, the one that nearly crippled the country.
And we're still here. We're still paying pensions. We're at 3.5 billion. We've grown since then. So that's the normal volatility of investing. And when you invest, you want a diversified portfolio. So we want money in equities because that's where over the longer term you get the main growth. We want money in some protection assets, so some bonds, for example. We want some other diversifying assets, property. So the returns on these are not necessarily all correlated, and when some are doing really well, some will not be. So over the long term, you get that straight line, get all the bumps in it, of an increasing return of our actuaries saying we need, say, 4% per annum. So within that 4% per annum, we might have a minus 20%, we might have a minus 30%, but it's about, this is why I'm always saying we have to have that long-term perspective. We need to stay invested as per we've agreed our strategy, because our strategy should be meeting our risk and return requirements. The danger, the key risk really is what government decide to do. And that's something we can respond to consultations with, but at the end of the day, we probably have very little say in their decision making. If they decide they've taken the assets onto the book, overall the LGPS is 150% funded, they'll happily take the liabilities as well and fill some of that black hole, which was a concern before the consultation came out. That was one of the potential options. Unfortunately, there's very little we can do about that. But for our scheme members, the benefits they've accrued to that point will be guaranteed. Whether they change the scheme going forward, again, benefits are set by government. They're not set by us. We have no say in that. The unions have an input, but we as a committee have no say. But all benefits accrued are guaranteed. They can't retrospectively change that. But I think that's the key risk we have, is that political one of what might a government do in the future.
Next thing.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So for the time being, you don't have to cancel Christmas. Thank you, Chairman. Wish you all well. Sorry, I'm going to miss your presentation.
Tom, the other
No,
question.
good.
Yeah. Goes on from what Councillor String and Councillor Key was saying. I find this consultation very disturbing, actually, if you read between the lines on what they actually want to do long term. Long term, I suspect, and it is merely a hunch based on this, they will give pools increasing power. We will be given increasingly less as a committee, but we will still officially set strategy. So if it goes wrong, we will be left holding the proverbial baby with the bathwater chucked out and told, your problem, go and fix it. The other thing that worries me is the government, and it's not just this government, the last one did it as well, continually going on about, oh, you must invest locally. Based on what that means on that consultation, that's a concern to me, because what it basically means, and Councillor Strangle alluded to it, they won't come out and say it openly because they don't seem to have an honest bone in their body at the moment. But they will basically raid the pension fund for their pet projects in infrastructure or whatever else they want to do, and we will be left with the deficit, because infrastructure never makes money, it always costs money, and then it'll be our responsibility as a committee to fill that deficit once they've had their hands full and taken what they wanted. It is very, very worrying, because, as I said, I simply think this is at the start of, we're not mandating it, but we essentially are, because if you don't do it, we're going to hit you with a massive stick anyway, and we're going to make you do it. They just haven't got the guts to say we're going to mandate it. They need to be honest, Chairman. I think we need to be quite blunt and say, if you are going to mandate it, be honest and say you're going to mandate it. Don't beat around the bush, because we're not stupid. We weren't all born yesterday. We know what's coming, you know. And this is what frustrates me, because this is what, to me, that's what this paper seemed like. In the long term, it may not be this consultation, maybe the next one, it may be within a year or 2 or 3 years. If they don't get what they deem they want, they will do it anyway, and they will take power away from here, because that's already happened. The 20, as Joe's already alluded to, 2016 regulations did that. This is another step on that line, but we're increasingly being told as members, oh, you must professionalise, you must do this, you must learn this, you must learn this. Well, if we have to learn all these things, don't tell us how to suck an egg and which egg to suck. Get out of the way and let's do the job, or do it yourself. But this halfway house is becoming increasingly slanted and only in one direction, Chairman, as far as I can see from reading between the lines, because they won't come out and say it and put it in black and white. But if you read between them, that very much is their end goal, I think. And I know there is absolutely nothing we can do about it. But I think we need to put a representation into the effect of, we know what you're actually doing. If you're going to do it, come out and say you're going to do it and don't beat around the bush, because we're not falling for it.
Yeah, I think you're right, Tom. We were nervous what was for the mansion aspect, and I do believe we're still nervous for the future because nothing's set in stone, and they can eventually mandate. That's why I think they're giving the other pools the chance to get properly regulated, so that they're on a path. But I can't see two pools, whole pools, amalgamating in an easy way. I really can't, because you've got individuals, you've got the regulation problem. To me, it would be a big headache. You know, we're all bored of the coast on in 6 years or more. You know, with increased staff, investing more, and that must be a headache for the staff that boarded the coast to actually organise and make sure it's all running okay. No, it doesn't mean that they will not mandate to do whatever, I must admit. Joe?
Yeah, if I can just come back. I think the first point would be that all this is where we were going pre-general election.
Yeah.
So all parties are very much aligned with this. As I say, I think with the funds that I've spoken to, I think this is actually a positive outcome for us in Lincolnshire and the other Border to Coast partners. There will be very little change. The requirement for the training, which will become mandatory, we have it as a mandatory requirement within this committee, bringing the July training paper every year, and all members sign up to doing that. That will become mandatory within the regulations to align to the pension board training. But actually, how can you hold an investment manager to account if you don't understand what they're doing? So I think the training is critical and as important as if you're appointing an investment manager yourself, because you need to understand what they're doing and why. You need to be able to, working along with advisors, but to be able to challenge that. And that is the key role for the Pensions Committee, to be able to challenge that performance and what they're doing. I think on, the government pushing for everything to be FCA regulated, again, we looked at this right at the beginning and wanted to do that in building Border to Coast, because prior to that, we would never have given our money to a manager that wasn't FCA regulated. Why would we do that? We want professionals with the full knowledge, the qualifications, the experience to be able to manage our money. So I personally have no concerns in it going to Border to Coast. What we have to do is ensure that we are as strong as possible as Lincolnshire Pension Fund, as all the partner funds together, as the joint committee, to enable ourselves to do that proper oversight and challenge, to ask the right questions, to hold them to account, but to work with them. So this one thing that we're very clear on, and Border to Coast are very clear on, Border to Coast, as was discussed in the 2030 strategy, are our 12th partner. It's not an us and them. If you knew the number of meetings that I had across various groups, with the senior officer groups, with Section 151 pools, with joint committee, with officers, we work so closely with Border to Coast, far more closely than we ever did when we appointed a manager, where we were given basically what they did. We did not have the insight. We did not have that underlying knowledge to be able to really go in and poke those tyres. So personally, I think it was a bit of a sigh of relief when the consultation came out, because for Lincolnshire, there's not a lot of change for us. The couple of areas which I won't do my script, I will just continue talking if that's okay. The key areas where we have raised concerns, and we've had these in the discussions with Border to Coast in the pool response, we've had them at the joint committee, it's not just Lincolnshire concerns. Local investment you mentioned, absolutely, we will be looking to raise that in our response. We don't believe that local investment should just mean the region you're in. We see lots of potential conflicts if we have to look for local investments working with our combined authority, which obviously we'll have from May next year, or with the administering authority, where our objectives are very different. We're wanting a good return within the right risk parameters for our investment. Very different objectives perhaps to a combined authority, which is looking to bring in further investment, to look to bring in jobs, etc. So we're working against different targets. Now, the one positive thing I think they've put in the consultation is that the pool will be responsible for doing that due diligence. So they will have to build up teams, if they're not there already within pools, to be able to look at any investment opportunities that the fund, in combination with discussions with its combined authority, with its regional authorities or whatever, will bring those propositions to the pool, who will do professional due diligence on them, looking at our investment objectives and strategy that we've set and agreed as a fund. Does this proposal meet that? If it's something that they say is going to give you 2% per annum, then no, the answer will be very simply no. And in taking that decision away from the pensions committee saying no, I think that removes a lot of potential pressure and conflicts of interest. And if it's a really good objective, a really good investment proposal, then let's open it up to other boards to case partner funds as well. You know, if we're going to get something that's CPI linked plus 3% for 25 years, fantastic. Well, you know, we would bite their arm off. So it's about having that professional oversight of any opportunities coming in that will then say, yes, this will fit your strategy, but it will be done in partnership. It's not, they will just say, the regulations do, the consultation does perhaps read like that, but our role as a partner fund, our role with the joint committee, our role as officers is to ensure that that relationship is right and is right for what we need to do. So very, very long-winded answer.
It's a difficult question. If I can come back briefly, Jen. The other frustrating thing for me is that, and you mentioned it as positive, but obviously it's quite, certainly from a pension committee point, quite frustrating, is we are now being told our primary advice must come from a certain source, whereas currently I can go to the income line, go to whoever we want to and say, advise me. And personally, I found the advice over the time that Ethan here and others and Peter, when we were very advised of the program, I find that hugely invaluable to be told, especially in terms of Home Robinson, etc. Oh no, you can't do that anymore. Yes, it is totally balmy. You don't mark your own homework, Chairman. When people mark their own homework, it doesn't end very well, does it? Because everyone goes, oh yeah, it's wonderful. And you can, if you're involved in an organisation, we're all guilty of it. You know, as councillors, we are protective of LCC when we think someone is saying something unfair about the organisation as a whole, because we're attached, we become protected, you become part of its entity and being. So you almost have a bit, sometimes you have to check yourself to make sure you don't have rose tinted glasses. And that's my worry with that requirement. It's all well and good, but you're marking your own homework and it doesn't end well.
Absolutely, absolutely agree there. And that's one of the other areas that I would want to, we would like to push back, because I do believe that the pool needs to be involved in those conversations, because they've got to create the vehicles and ensure that the vehicles are there and fit for purpose. However, kind of in our draft response, when we've gone through and just noted some things prior to this conversation, we believe that there is a role for investment consultants. Absolutely, that the issue has been, and government seem to have a dislike. I don't know if it's Ian, but it's like investment consultancy firms. Now, I think some of that problem is because some funds have hidden behind their investment consultant to allow them not to call. So it's the investment consultant may have been pushing, well, we've got a great manager here, we don't want to go with the pool because they don't do that. But that's the way investment consultants have always made money in the past, by recommending managers and managing that whole churn process of changing managers. So our response will be, there is absolutely a role, be it for investment consultants, be it for absolutely independent advisors, and it's for the committee and for the officers to ensure that they are properly aligned with the pool to look at. They provide that critical challenge and oversight and the committee and officers need the assistance with that.
Exactly.
So we will very much be pushing that forward in our response, because I 100% agree. I think there is a huge danger and a potential conflict of interest with that marking at your own home. So hopefully that reassures you that we will be very forceful in that response.
I think my concern is, you said that Lincolnshire has been brought against the local located mineral. My concern is what's the sort of critical mass that model can go to before then doesn't work properly. I think that's the point that the strength of the trade flow that with 11 or 12 before scales would work. Not quite by that model doesn't work. I think that it's got that some work is going on to sort of look at that. The way everything, because it'd be a shame to have arrangement to be broken if it's either forced upon us or as a naturally evolving the numbers grow.
Absolutely, and that's been a discussion at many meetings. I don't think we've come to a conclusive answer that X is the right number of partner funds or X is the maximum. We know we don't want to be like London Civ. We think there is capacity should some really good aligned funds come to us, that will have to come in, and I think there will be very rigorous checks that are done to ensure that, you know, we've worked very well in being one of the smaller funds. It's one fund, one vote. Lincolnshire has a strong voice at the table, as strong as the South Yorkshires or the Tyne-and-Wears that are 3-4 times, 5 times bigger than us. So I think there is the capacity, but as I say, it would be a very managed process. We are not, and I'm assuming boards to post, I'm not out there touting for business, going and talking to funds, say come join us, because at the end of the day, it's a shareholder decision. So we would be presented with basically a business case sort of document. If there were other funds coming in, they need to bring some benefits in. They need to be willing to invest in the funds that we have. They need to match our culture. How we work together. Partnership is key. Partnership is the key thing. If we can't trust, respect each other, then we don't have a relationship. So I couldn't tell you what the number is, but we know it's not 32. Whether it's another 3 funds, another 4, we would have to look at that. But I think it's much more about who comes in than a particular number. You wouldn't want anybody disruptive coming in, because if you only be one person at the table that can really upset the whole dynamic. So probably not fully answered your question, but it's something that we're well aware of. And there is that oversight and challenge to ensure that any suggestions and proposals that would come to the shareholders, there would be much due diligence that will have gone on before that. I'd say it will be a shareholder decision, but it would be Andrew and Michelle and their equivalents at the other partner funds that would need to be comfortable.
I think that's okay with on a fund basis. The risk will be if it's on a pool basis or pool people across with a number of partners, all of a sudden that would be.
You still have to follow the same process. You still absolutely have to follow the same process.
The numbers could suddenly, it's not
Yeah.
1 or 2, it could be 7 or 8 that suddenly are pulled.
In my personal opinion, I can't see that pools will merge. There might be one pool that could potentially merge with another, but they're both 2 very small pools. I think the way, the pools are very proud of what they've done, the pool companies. And I think there are very few that would want to go cap in hand to another pool and say, can we come and join you? I think there may be funds that think, actually, I'm not too content with what the pool is offering. Can we go elsewhere for somewhere that fits us better? But as I say, even if there were to be discussions between 2 pools, again, it's still a shareholder decision. There would still have to be all that underlying work done to ensure that the shareholders could agree that.
But saying that if pools sit on their hands and do very little in the next year or 2 to attract 1 or 2 other funds, then I do think the government will take it at stern ability. and bring more regulation into it. Okay. I think, you know, my suggestion to board of the coast is you don't sit on your hands. You've got to be working, looking for just the funds that actually board of the coast investment.
I think it's good assurance to the community that Board of the Coast, certainly not sitting on our hands. I guess we're in a position as being one of the larger pools that say, oh, we're okay, good consultation. But from their perspective, is incorporating a lot of what's coming anyway, but certainly not resting on the penny rolls or some of that.
If I can, I'll just say the other thing that so you can see the proposals. What we will do is we will ensure that the feedback that we've had today is incorporated into a draft response. We'll share that before Christmas with you, and we will bring a final draft response to the January 16th committee for your approval. That is the deadline day, so I hope not to be put in the midnight all of that day because we have board in the afternoon. But hopefully that will pick up those points and concerns that have been raised today. The other thing that has to be done within the consultation is something that the pool has to do, all the pools have to do, is to present to government a plan of how they're going to meet the requirements and the capabilities to do what is being asked of them. The deadline for that is the 1st of March. And all of the capabilities, etc., have to be in place or within consultation. So they have to be all kind of ready to go basically for the 1st of April 2026. So it's not a long period. That's, you know, some pools that have to get FCA regulation. That's really not a long time. What government are doing though is working with the pools as these plans are being made. So it may be that there are some conversations being had already saying, we don't think yours is a viable model, so unless you can show us something very different. But in that response from the pool, there's already a number of workshops set up with officers to work with the pool to see how do we get those capabilities. So again, this isn't just the pool going away and putting a plan in place. This is the pool working with Department of Funds, with the joint committee, senior officers to ensure that whatever plan is put in place is accepted and agreed by the Department of Funds as well. But as I say, a lot of it we already had in the 2030 strategy. So the plans were there. It's perhaps some things that just happen to be brought forward in timetable. So if there are any other thoughts anyone has that they would like captured in the response, though, please do let me know. We'll ensure that we cover as much as we
can. My question is totally different to Paul and everything. Being I'm an academy representative, I'm trying to think from that viewpoint. I know I've mentioned it numerous times at committee, but given there's been a pension review, has there been any looking at, in my opinion, the discrepancy between the employee rate and the employee rate? Given most employees is around 6% and most employers are paying 25%, so that helps to pick up with employers. I know there's going to be an increase in the teachers' employee rate. I know that's a totally different scheme. I think they're going to be averaging about 10% for employees and about the same for employers. So there's a lot of talk about the pool, and I haven't seen anything in here. Has there been any conversation about that?
So this is the first stage of the pensions review that is looking mainly at the investment aspect. Now, the second stage is going to be looking at things like auto enrolment. I've not heard anything about looking at that. I'm looking across to EMC if he's heard anything about that being looked at. I mean, one of the things that does happen following every evaluation is the cost envelope is re-looked at, and there are certain, for the scheme as a whole, if costs overall have increased, then where those cost increases have come from are looked at, and does that make sense? If they've gone past, there's a window of tolerance, envelope of tolerance. If they've gone above that, then potentially there can be changes put in place. If they've gone below that, there can be changes put in place. So if the scheme's got cheaper, it might be that they increase benefits for scheme members. One of the things, though, that doesn't come into that cost analysis for impacting scheme members' contribution rates or benefits is investment return, though. But that does get looked at every time. I think the last time we were within the cost envelope, so there were no changes coming forward to scheme benefits or member contribution rates. So it is looked at in the whole every 3 years. But I don't think there has been that whole scale review, that step back. I mean, what hopefully will be happening, we've obviously got valuation coming up. I'll jinx it now, but hopefully, you know, our aim is to ensure that the rate remains stable. The future service rate, if you recall, at the last valuation increased considerably because of inflation, basically, and future inflationary expectations. That has reduced. So initial discussions, and caveat that this is no guarantee before it's thrown back at me in a year's time. That, you know, we would hope that perhaps that cost of future pension may have come back a little bit, so that primary rate will at least be stable. We're not hoping that's not going to increase. It may for some reduce. We're still in a reasonable funding position for most employers across, so there won't be those secondary payments or very few, we hope. So I think we're in a reasonable position. We'll be working, and the committee will be getting involved with those assumption settings. At the March meeting, we'll be having the actuary come and go through how the assumption setting process is done. Then at the July meeting, we'll be looking at what those assumptions will be for the 2025 valuation. So I do, you know, the initial was 1/3, 2/3 between scheme member and employer. I think the average scheme member across the whole of the fund is about 6.5%, 6.4%. But yeah, it has moved away from that 1/3, 2/3 for a number of years. So it does get raised regularly, but it's one of those things because it's set by government. Unfortunately, it is out of our hands.
Can I ask one more question as well, just to get it clear in my head about what the future will look like for the employees and when we talk about the government? Because at the moment, if you are a caretaker in Scunthorpe, you know, within the East Riding pension scheme, and you move to the Aston and you're in the Lincolnshire pension, is that still going to happen in the future, or would you be part of the Border to Coast pension scheme?
So Border to Coast is solely about the investment.
What's
Now, there was a throwaway in the consultation about the rules to administration. There hasn't been anything to say that the funds should all just join together within their pool to become a Border to Coast pension fund, LGPS pension fund. So that has not been particularly talked about. Merger of funds has been, but as I say, I think that will now be through the back door. As long as we ensure we're meeting the requirements, we're doing a good job as a committee, as a fund, as a board across the whole. I don't see that there will be pressure to merge funds at this point. Going forwards, I honestly, my crystal ball doesn't work that far. It could well be 86 funds starting fresh now would not make sense. But to be honest, a bugbear of mine, most of our scheme members don't know what fund they're in. They think they're in the West Yorkshire Pension Fund. So the fact that if they were to move from East Riding to Lincolnshire or wherever, is not so much an issue. The key thing is that we keep our members informed of what's happening and ensure that they're confident that they're not going to lose their benefits, which is a concern when they start seeing all these happening.
Anybody else? Anything on that matter? Well, the recommendation now, page 135, we can find out if we agree with that. Fine. Yeah, thank you. Okay. Right now, we've got consideration for information. We have the last member of the public to leave. I'll read that out. And thank you both for hearing. I hope you've learned a lot. And I'll leave it to the we're going to organise a meeting with you. Interested in the conversation.
Get back in there. This is a bit.
Yeah, everybody wants to talk about. Yeah. A rather reminder the consideration of accepted information, it's in accordance with section 100A4 of the Local Government Act 1972. All of the agenda items have not been circulated to the press and public on the ground that they have considered containing sensitive information as defined in paragraph 3 of part 1 of section 12 actions of the Local Government Act 1972 as amended. Press and public may be excluded from the meeting for consideration of these items. As we can just vote that we agree that or disagree, then all those lovely. Anybody against that? I have accepted. So just 5 minutes, comfort break.